Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. When the United States declared war in April 1917, it was unprepared to actually fight a war in Europe. The regular army was small, and American industry needed time to produce war materials on a massive scale. It also needed time to train and transport troops. States would play an important role in mobilization, both in terms of manpower and in terms of resources and industry. The 48 states that made up the United States in 1917 were all able to contribute in unique ways, based on their demographics, their industry, and their natural resources. And today we will focus on the contributions of North Carolina, and we are joined by Charlie Knight, the Curator of Military History for the North Carolina Museum of History. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
So once the United States declares war in April of 1917, state National Guard units are pretty key to building up the American Expeditionary Forces. So tell us about the North Carolina Army National Guard. What units are mobilized and what campaigns will North Carolina National Guard soldiers serve in?
North Carolina's National Guard, like a lot of other states, had been called into duty in 1916 to go down to the U.S.-Mexican border while Pershing was after Pancho Villa in Mexico. The National Guard units were stationed along the border in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico to guard against any other incursions into the United States from Mexico. Most of the North Carolina guys had been stationed around El Paso. So it kind of served almost as a bit of a dress rehearsal for what they would do in 1917 and 1918. They didn't see any active combat, of course, down there, but it got them kind of used to, if you will, serving for more than just a day or two at a time or for the annual muster. It got them really, I think, acclimated to serving in an army. Again, no combat, no real active campaigning. It was more guard duty than anything else, but it was stuff that they had not been exposed to during their usual training. When the war begins, the National Guard is federalized again. A lot of North Carolina's National Guardsmen will serve in the 30th Division, along with Guardsmen from Tennessee and South Carolina, and they will also contribute a unit to the 42nd Rainbow Division, MacArthur's division. The 117th Engineer Train of the Rainbow Division comes from North Carolina. They will see quite a bit of action. The 30th is actually one of the first units to break through the German lines during the war, and they see, like I say, quite a bit of action later on when you see more conscripts or draftees rather coming into play. A lot of their officers and NCO cadre is pulled from the 30th and moves over to the 81st Division, which was largely a North Carolina unit. So the North Carolina's National Guard is right in the thick of things here throughout the war. And in fact, the Camp Glenn, which was the pre-war home, the pre-war training base of the North Carolina National Guard near Morehead City, that becomes a Navy base during the war. It later also becomes the first Coast Guard air station in the country. So a little bit of useless trivia for you there.
So you mentioned some installations, and there are 3 military camps that are built in North Carolina during the war. Camp Greene near Charlotte, Camp Bragg near Fayetteville, and Camp Polk near Raleigh. What can you tell us about them?
They were huge bases at the time. Greene and Polk, you'd never even know they existed. There was also a fourth one, only existed for a couple of months at the beginning of 1918. Camp Chronicle out in the western part of the state, Gastonia, west of Charlotte. That was an artillery training base. Camp Greene was a huge place, like you say, near Charlotte. Thousands of men passed through there. Of the 3 of these, Bragg is the only one that still exists today. Camp Polk which was part of it is the NC State campus today. It was huge. It was just west of Raleigh. It had been historically a training base for at least two wars prior to that, during the Civil War and the Spanish-American War. Part of what became Camp Polk was also training grounds for North Carolina troops. The Army envisioned Camp Polk to be their main armor, their main tank training base. But the war ended before Camp Polk even really finished getting built. And if I'm not mistaken, the tank base up in Gettysburg, Camp Colt, really kind of superseded Polk later in the war. And of course, neither one of those two exist today.
So, including the North Carolina National Guard, do we know how many soldiers from North Carolina served in the war?
It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 86,000 total North Carolinians. Of those, about just under 61,000 were drafted. So North Carolina contributed quite a few men to the war effort. It was somewhere around 5,000, I believe, would be killed. Not all of those were battle deaths. There was less than 1,000 who were actually killed in action. The majority of those were wounded or died of disease and non-combat related injuries.
Now, I read that about a quarter of the troops from North Carolina were African American. What units were they serving in?
Most of them, this is a subject that we really don't know a lot about. There were not good records kept on the African American troops, not just from North Carolina, but from anywhere. The Army really did not focus on their service in the post-war years like they did on other units, on the white units. There's no unit histories that exist on these, so it's really difficult to track down a lot of information about them. A lot of them would go into what were called labor battalions for both the Army and the Navy. They were given rear echelon units. They would be the ones loading and unloading ships, loading and unloading boxcars. But there were, of course, some combat troops as well. There were a couple of noteworthy ones. One of the main ones from North Carolina, a fellow by the name of William Johnson. He was from Winston-Salem, but he moved to New York as a teenager. And he would serve with the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters. And he was in essence, a foxhole with one other comrade. And the Germans went out on a prisoner grab, so to speak, to gain some prisoners to bring back to headquarters and interrogate. And Johnson and the fellow who was with him, I believe his last name was Harris, they wanted no part of this, understandably. And as the Germans approached them, these two guys fought tooth and nail. They pretty much eliminated this German squad that was at least 24 men. Both of the two American soldiers were wounded multiple times. And as a result, they survived the ordeal. They make their way back to the main lines. And both of these two guys wind up being the first American recipients of the French Croix de Guerre. And for Johnson, anyway, there was a campaign in the post-war years. Neither one of these two received any sort of American decoration. They were actually serving as part of the French army at this time. So they got French decorations, but nothing from the United States. And in the post-war years, there was an effort that really gained steam within the past couple of decades for both of them to get the recognition they deserved. I mean, what these guys had done, bordered on the superhuman, fighting off the amount of Germans that they did. Long story short, several years ago, Johnson was presented with the Medal of Honor. He's one of 3 North Carolinians who would receive that decoration during or as a result of their World War I service.
Can you highlight the service of any other soldiers from North Carolina in the war?
There was several notable ones that come to mind. My favorite figure of the war is a woman by the name of Madeline Hancock. She was a very colorful figure. She was the first North Carolinian to volunteer for World War I, quite possibly the first American to volunteer for the war effort. She was raised in Asheville and Raleigh, comes from a very wealthy family. Her father was actually one of the personal physicians for the Vanderbilt family at their estate, Biltmore, out near Asheville. And she attended college in Raleigh, went north to New York after she graduated from there. Was very popular on the social scene in New York and elsewhere, and she married a British Army officer who was stationed in India at the time World War I breaks out. And when England joined the war, she within days volunteered to join the war effort. She would serve as a nurse in Belgium and France throughout the entire war. So she missed just the first couple of days of the war. And like I say, she's, as far as we can tell, the first North Carolinian to do this. She left very detailed letters, very fascinating things to read. She treated wounded from both sides. When you read some of her letters, she comments on how surprised she was that the German soldiers were just like the Americans and the British. They just spoke a different language. They didn't want to be there any more than anybody else did. And it's interesting. She really pours out her soul in a lot of these letters that she wrote to family and friends back home. It really sounds like she was on the verge of a mental breakdown throughout most of the war, which is quite understandable considering what she was going through, treating these young men who had, in some cases lost limbs, lost eyesight, just really unimaginable horrors. But she always kept up a strong front for her patients, so much so that they referred to her as Morning Glory, because despite what was going on in her head, she always had this very cheery demeanor. They never knew that anything was amiss with her, and she loved that nickname so much she officially changed her name to Glory and became known as Glory Hancock throughout the rest of her life. And she would receive decorations from several countries as a result of her wartime service: England, France, Belgium, but nothing from the United States, surprisingly, even though she was from here. And she becomes the most decorated woman, not just of World War I, but of all history up to that point, serving with the British Red Cross. And incidentally, I would be remiss if I did not mention that we have her medals in the museum. So she's, like I say, my favorite figure when it comes to North Carolina and World War I. Several others, Kiffin Rockwell and his brother Paul, were two of the early Americans to join the war effort as well. They were attending Washington and Lee, I believe, at the beginning of the war. And Kiffin decided he wanted to go get involved. The United States had not yet entered the conflict. This was still a European affair at this point. So he convinces his brother. They go over, join the French Foreign Legion. Kiffin decides that fighting on the ground is not for him. So he's one of the first members of what we know today as the Lafayette Escadrille. The squadron is part of the French army that was made up of American pilots. There is a character in that movie Flyboys that's based on him. He is the first American to shoot down a German plane during the war. He's also one of the first Americans who dies during the war. There were several other members of the Lafayette Escadrille. James McConnell was from North Carolina as well. And there are several others of these guys who were among the wave of first, if you will, to go over and join the war before the United States got involved. I mentioned Johnson as well. There are many of these guys who are stories worth telling, but those are some of my favorites.
So we've talked about the war, we've talked about kind of the battlefield and the people that served in that theater. How does North Carolina mobilize for the war in terms of the home front and in terms of industry?
Before the war, North Carolina was primarily rural economy. There were quite a few factories that were starting to be developed for textiles. The furniture industry was really coming into play as well. A lot of those factories switched from making peacetime production over to making supplies for the war effort. Some of the textile factories switched over to making uniforms and equipment. Some of the furniture factories, there was one in High Point that I can think of that started making propellers for aircraft. And it's kind of a smaller scale of what you see during World War II, but Everybody was really affected by this, both in terms of having to switch over to a war economy type of thing, and with tens of thousands of the men serving in uniform. There really wasn't a household in North Carolina that was not affected in some way, shape, or form by the war.
Any final thoughts on North Carolina and World War One?
The North Carolina Museum of History, the military aspect of our collection is probably the largest. Well, not probably, it is the largest part of the museum collection. And there's two main chunks of that, really. The Civil War collection and the World War One collection account for probably 2/3 of the military stuff that we have. And we have so much stuff that relates to the 30th Division during World War One. The reason for that, the museum's founder, Fred Olds, he knew a lot of these guys. He served in the National Guard, and he knew all of these officers. So he had no problem at all asking them for their stuff, in some cases during the war, but definitely once they got home. He was, very proactive in getting World War One items into our collection. So we've got quite a bit of World War One stuff from the various officers and units that were in the 30th Division. It ranges from stuff from future governors of North Carolina to captured German stuff that was brought back. We've got all kinds of stuff from the 30th Division. There's a MacArthur tie. I mentioned the 117th Engineer Train served in the Rainbow Division. We have a button from a guy who served in one of the infantry units in the 42nd. He was sent in as a replacement into one of the infantry units, and he took a bullet right in the chest, and it glanced off of one of his tunic buttons, just enough to save his life. He was still pretty badly wounded by this, but it spared his life, and he kept that button. So that was one of the things that we had on display when we had our World War One exhibit during the centennial. You don't see a lot about the 81st Division, the Wildcat Division, in the Fred Olds era of the museum, but in the post-World War One years, we started collecting a lot of stuff from the 81st, which was composed primarily of draftees from North Carolina. I have a lot of stuff from enlisted men in that, and it's interesting when you compare our World War One collections. The 30th Division collection is primarily officers. The 81st is, with one exception, all enlisted men. And, so we've got a good combination of things there. Speaking of the 81st Division, they were the first division in the United States Army to be authorized to wear a shoulder patch. So there's some North Carolina trivia for you as well. We have a small piece of Kiffin Rockwell's plane that he was shot down in. We have some of his medals. We have some of James McConnell's medals, and a bit of personal connection to our World War One collection. Right when I first started working at the North Carolina Museum of History, as you know, Amanda, some of your listeners may know as well, I used to be curator there at MacArthur. I was invited to a reunion of the 113th Field Artillery, which was one of the North Carolina National Guard units that was part of the 30th Division. They still exist today. They were having a big reunion as part, I believe it was their centennial reunion, but I could be mistaken on that. And they had a gathering. They had brought out some of their own historical artifacts, and they had asked us to loan the colors that the 113th had used or had carried at that time, 1917, 1918. That was part of our collection. So I took that out to their reunion. It was in High Point. This would have been 2017. And when I got there, they had the official colors that the unit had carried in World War II. That was part of their collection. And so for the first time, as far as we know, ever, we were able to put the 113th's colors from World War I right next to the ones from World War II. As a result of that, they provided the funds to conserve and frame the World War I colors, and they later donated the World War II colors to us. So that was a pretty good thing to come out of that reunion there. So there's a lot of 113th stuff in our collection as well. Like I say, we now have the official unit colors from both World Wars.
That's really interesting. I always think North Carolina has such a rich military history. So thank you for all your work that you do to preserve a lot of that. And Charlie, always a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.